The house was silent except for the creak of old wood settling in the winter wind. Sarah stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, her phone clutched in her trembling hand as another footstep echoed from the bedroom above. Slow, deliberate, heavy. She had just checked on the children 5 minutes ago. Both were sound asleep. So who was walking in the Hendersons' house? The rational part of her brain screamed to run, to grab the kids and flee into the night. But something else, something she couldn't explain, kept her rooted to that spot, staring up into the darkness of the second floor. Because in that moment, Sarah realized that the footsteps weren't coming from just any room. They were coming from the locked room at the end of the hall. The room Mrs. Henderson had specifically told her never ever to enter. The perfect job. Sarah Morrison needed this job more than she'd ever needed anything in her 19 years of life. Sitting in the Hendersons' pristine living room 3 weeks earlier, she'd smoothed down her thrift store blazer and tried to look like someone who had her life together. She didn't. Her mother's medical bills were stacking up like a mountain of impossible choices, and her college fund had evaporated faster than morning dew in August. Community college would have to wait another year. Maybe 2. Maybe forever. "You come highly recommended," Mrs. Henderson said, her manicured fingers wrapped around a delicate teacup. She was beautiful in that effortless way wealthy women often are, blonde hair pulled back in a perfect ponytail, yoga pants that probably cost more than Sarah's entire outfit, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Our last babysitter had to leave rather suddenly." Sarah nodded eagerly. "I love children. I've been babysitting since I was 14, and I have references from—" "I'm sure you're wonderful," Mrs. Henderson interrupted gently. "It's not the children I'm worried about. Emma is 7 and absolutely delightful. Mason is 4 and full of energy but sweet as can be." She paused, setting down her teacup with a soft clink. "It's the house." Something in the way she said it made Sarah's skin prickle. "The house? It's old, built in 1887. It makes noises. Settling, the furnace, pipes. Some people find it unsettling." Mrs. Henderson's eyes searched Sarah's face. "Our last babysitter was very young. She got spooked easily. Are you the type to get spooked, Sarah?" Sarah thought about her mother lying in that hospital bed, about the final notice from the electric company, about the emptiness in their refrigerator. She met Mrs. Henderson's gaze squarely. "No, ma'am, I'm not." "Good." Mrs. Henderson's smile widened, though it still didn't touch those pale blue eyes. "Then there's just one rule. One very important rule." She stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the snow-covered yard, the room at the end of the upstairs hall, the one with the dark wood door. "It stays locked, always. You don't go in, you don't open it, you don't even try the handle." "Do you understand?" Sarah's throat felt dry. "What's in there?" "Storage," Mrs. Henderson said quickly. Too quickly. "Old family things, fragile antiques, things that could be dangerous for children. The door is locked and I keep the only key." She turned back to Sarah. "Can you follow this one simple rule?" The logical part of Sarah's brain whispered warnings. But the desperate part, the part that had watched her mother cry over bills she couldn't pay, won out. "Yes, I can follow that rule." "Wonderful. Then you're hired. We'll need you Friday night, 7 to midnight. My husband and I have a charity gala." That had been 3 weeks ago. In that time, Sarah had babysat the Henderson children 6 times, and every single time she had felt the presence of that locked room like a weight on her shoulders. Emma and Mason were indeed delightful children, curious, affectionate, well-behaved. The house, though. The house was something else entirely. It did make noises, constant, unnerving noises. Creaks and groans and whispers of wind through gaps she couldn't locate. Sometimes she swore she heard music, faint and tinny, like an old music box playing somewhere far away. She told herself it was the heating system, her imagination, the wind. She told herself a lot of things. The locked room haunted her thoughts. She'd passed it dozens of times, always averting her eyes, fighting the urge to touch the ornate brass handle. The door itself was beautiful in a Gothic way, carved dark walnut with intricate patterns of vines and flowers. It didn't match any other door in the house. It looked older, more substantial, like it had been there long before the rest of the structure was built around it. Emma had caught her staring at it once, The little girl had appeared beside her so silently that Sarah had jumped. "Mommy says we can't ever go in there," Emma had said matter-of-factly. "Why not?" Sarah had asked before she could stop herself. Emma's expression had grown solemn, her 7-year-old face suddenly looking much older. "Because of the sad lady. She doesn't like to be disturbed." Before Sarah could ask what that meant, Mason had called out from downstairs, and Emma had skipped away, leaving Sarah staring at the door with a chill running down her spine. On this particular Friday night, the 7th time babysitting for the Hendersons, Sarah had pushed all thoughts of locked rooms and sad ladies out of her mind. She'd focused on making it a special evening for the kids. They'd built a blanket fort in the living room, made popcorn, and watched a Disney movie. Mason had fallen asleep halfway through, his small head heavy on Sarah's shoulder. Emma had lasted until the end but had been yawning widely. Sarah had carried Mason upstairs first, tucking him into his race car bed and pulling his favorite dinosaur blanket up to his chin. He'd murmured something unintelligible and rolled onto his side, one small hand curled beneath his cheek. Her heart had squeezed. He reminded her of her little cousin, of innocence and trust and all the things worth protecting in this world. Emma had walked up the stairs on her own, but Sarah had helped her into her nightgown and braided her long blonde hair. "Will you check for monsters?" Emma had asked sleepily. Of course. Sarah had made a show of looking under the bed, in the closet, behind the curtains. "All clear. No monsters allowed when I'm on duty." "You're my favorite babysitter," Emma had mumbled, already half asleep. "Way better than the last one." She was always scared. Scared of what? Sarah had asked, but Emma's breathing had already deepened into sleep. Sarah had stood in the doorway for a moment, watching both children. Emma's room connected to Mason's through a Jack and Jill bathroom, and she could see both of them from where she stood. They looked peaceful, safe, perfectly fine. She'd pulled both doors partially closed and headed downstairs, glancing at her phone. 10:47 p.m. The Hendersons would be home by midnight. She settled onto the couch, pulling out her phone to check on her mother. The hospice nurse had sent a text. She had a good day. Ate some soup. Asked about you. "Don't worry, sweetie. Enjoy your evening." Sarah had felt tears prick her eyes. Good days were becoming rarer. The doctors had been frank about what stage 4 meant, about how the cancer had spread beyond what treatment could touch. Her mother was dying, and these babysitting jobs were the only thing standing between them and complete financial ruin. She'd wiped her eyes and tried to focus on something else, scrolling mindlessly through social media. That's when she'd heard it. The first footstep. At first she'd thought she'd imagined it. The house was always making noise. But then it came again. Creak. A definite footstep. From upstairs, from the hallway outside the children's rooms. Sarah had frozen, her finger hovering over her phone screen. She'd listened intently. Silence. Then another creak. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving along the upstairs hallway. Her mind had ed through possibilities. Had one of the kids gotten up? But no. She would have heard a door open, and children's footsteps were lighter, faster. This sounded heavy. Adult. Wrong. She'd forced herself to stand, her legs trembling. "Emma?" she'd called out. "Mason? Are you up?" No response. The footsteps continued. Creak, creak, creak. Sarah had grabbed the fireplace poker from beside the couch, the closest thing to a weapon she could find, and started up the stairs. Her heart had been hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. With each step, her mind had offered terrible scenarios, an intruder, a break-in, someone who knew the parents were gone, the house occupied only by a teenage babysitter and 2 small children. But when she'd reached the top of the stairs, the hallway had been empty. She'd rushed to Emma's room, pushing the door open wider. Emma was fast asleep, her braided hair spread across her pillow, her chest rising and falling peacefully. Sarah had crossed quickly through the bathroom to check Mason's room. He was exactly as she'd left him, curled around his stuffed dinosaur, utterly undisturbed. Relief had washed over her so powerfully that she'd had to lean against the doorframe, just the house settling. Her imagination running wild because of Emma's comment about a sad lady and her own anxiety about everything else in her life. She'd taken a deep breath, willing her heartbeat to slow. That's when she'd heard it again. Creak. But this time she was upstairs. This time she could pinpoint exactly where it was coming from. Her blood had turned to ice water. The locked room. The footsteps were coming from inside the locked room at the end of the L. What the darkness holds. Sarah stood in the hallway, the fireplace poker clutched in her white-knuckled grip, staring at the dark wooden door. This wasn't her imagination. This wasn't the house settling. Someone, or something, was moving around inside that room. Every instinct screamed at her to grab the children and run, to call 911, to break Mrs. Henderson's one rule and get those kids to safety. But another part of her, the part that had spent 19 years being told she was too poor to matter, too young to understand, too insignificant to question authority, that part hesitated. What if she was wrong? What if there was a logical explanation? What if she called the police and it turned out to be nothing, and she lost this job, this money her mother desperately needed? Another footstep. Closer to the door now. And then, so faint she almost missed it, a sound that made her entire body go rigid with terror, crying. Someone was crying in that room. Soft, heartbroken sobs that spoke of a grief so deep it seemed to saturate the very air. Sarah's hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped the poker. She thought of her mother, of the way she'd cried when the diagnosis came back. She thought of Emma asking her to check for monsters. She thought of Mason's absolute trust as he'd fallen asleep on her shoulder. These children were her responsibility. Whatever was behind that door, she had to know if it posed a threat to them. She pulled out her phone and texted Mrs. Henderson with trembling fingers. "I hear someone in the locked room. Should I call police?" The response came almost immediately. "Don't go in that room. We're leaving now. 20 minutes. Do not go in. The crying continued. And now there were words mixed in with the sobs. Faint, anguished, "Please, help me, please." Sarah's heart shattered. That was a woman's voice. Someone was locked in that room crying, begging for help. Every moral fiber in her being revolted against leaving someone in such distress. Mrs. Henderson's warning echoed in her mind, but so did her own mother's voice, from years ago. When someone needs help, Sarah, you help them. That's what makes us human. She tried the door handle, knowing it would be locked. It was. But as her hand touched the cold brass, the crying stopped abruptly. The sudden silence was somehow worse than the sound. "Hello?" Sarah called out, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" For a moment, nothing. Then, "Sarah?" The voice was clearer now, right on the other side of the door. "Sarah Morrison?" Every hair on Sarah's body stood on end. How did whatever was in there know her name? "Who are you?" Sarah demanded, trying to sound brave and failing miserably. "I'm sorry," the voice said, and it sounded genuinely anguished. "I'm so sorry. I didn't want this for you. I tried to warn the others. I tried to make them leave. But she always brings new girls, young girls who need money desperately enough not to ask questions. Who's she? Mrs. Henderson? I don't understand." "Look in the chest," the voice interrupted urgently. "The blue chest in Emma's room, under the window. Look inside before they get back. You need to know the truth. You need to understand what you're really dealing with." "What truth? What?" But the voice had gone silent again. Sarah waited, her ear pressed against the door, but heard nothing more. The crying had stopped. The footsteps had stopped. It was as if no one had ever been there at all. Sarah glanced at her phone. 15 minutes until the Hendersons returned. Her hands were still shaking as she crept back into Emma's room, careful not to wake the sleeping child. There, under the window, was a blue-painted chest. She'd noticed it before. It looked like a toy box, decorated with hand-painted flowers and butterflies. Sarah knelt beside it and carefully lifted the lid, wincing as the hinges creaked. Inside were toys, coloring books, stuffed animals. Normal things. She started to feel foolish. Whatever was happening, she was losing her grip on reality. But then her fingers brushed against something at the bottom. A false bottom. It lifted away to reveal a hidden compartment. Inside were photographs. Dozens of them. Sarah pulled them out with trembling hands, holding them up to the moonlight streaming through the window. They were all of young women, teenagers really, around Sarah's age. Each photograph showed a different girl, but they all had one thing in common. They were standing in this very house, in this very living room, wearing what looked like babysitting clothes. Casual, comfortable, responsible-looking. On the back of each photo was a name and a date. Jennifer M., September 2019. Kaylee S., March 2020. Brittany H., October 2021. Ashley R., January 2020. Rachel T., 7 dates spanning 5 years. Severed said they're left suddenly. 7 RLS in 5 years. That wasn't normal turnover. That was something else entirely. Sarah kept digging through the chest, her breath coming in short gasps. There were newspaper clippings too, yellowed with age, missing person reports, Amber Alerts, and every single photo matched one of the girls in the photographs. Jennifer Martinez, 19, last seen leaving her home in Cedar Falls. Kaylee Stevens, 18, disappeared after telling her family she was going to a babysitting job. Ashley Rodriguez, 19, failed to return home from work. Sarah's vision blurred with tears. 7 girls, all missing, all last seen going to babysitting jobs, and here were their photos, hidden in a child's toy chest like trophies. A sound from downstairs made her jump, the front door opening. The Hendersons were home early. "Sarah?" Mrs. Henderson's voice floated up the stairs, sickly sweet. "We're back, dear. How were the children?" Sarah's mind raced. She shoved the photos and clippings back into the hidden compartment, replaced the false bottom, and closed the chest as quietly as she could. She stood on shaking legs just as Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway. "Checking on Emma?" Mrs. Henderson asked, but her eyes were sharp, calculating. She looked past Sarah to the chest, then back to Sarah's face. "You look pale, dear. Are you feeling all right?" "I'm fine," Sarah lied, her voice surprisingly steady. "Emma's been perfect. Both kids have been angels." Mrs. Henderson stepped further into the room, blocking the doorway. She was still beautiful, still polished, but now Sarah could see something else beneath the surface, something cold and hungry. "Did you hear anything unusual tonight?" Sarah thought about the crying, the voice warning her, the photographs of missing girls. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but Emma was asleep behind her, and Mason was in the next room. She couldn't leave them. Not until she understood what was happening. "Just the house settling," Sarah said. "You were right about it being noisy." Mrs. Henderson studied her for a long moment. "And you didn't go near the locked room?" "No, ma'am. I followed your rule." Something that might have been disappointment flickered across Mrs. Henderson's face. "Of course you did. You're such a good girl, Sarah. So obedient, so desperate for money to help your poor dying mother." The way she said it, with false sympathy dripping from every word, made Sarah's skin crawl. She forced herself to stay calm, to keep her expression neutral. "I should get going," Sarah said. "It's late." "Mr. Henderson will drive you home," Mrs. Henderson said. "It wasn't an offer. We couldn't possibly let you walk alone at this hour. It's dangerous out there. So many terrible things can happen to young girls who don't have anyone to protect them." The threat was clear, even if the words seemed caring. Sarah nodded, her mind spinning as she followed Mrs. Henderson downstairs. Mr. Henderson was waiting by the door, tall and silent, his expression unreadable. He hadn't spoken a word to Sarah in all the time she'd babysat. Now his presence felt menacing. During the car ride, Sarah clutched her phone in her pocket, her thumb hovering over the emergency call button. But what would she say? "I found photos of missing girls in the toy chest. I heard crying from a locked room." She had no proof. She'd everything in the chest. And if she accused the Hendersons without evidence, they'd simply deny it. Worse, if they were as dangerous as she now suspected, making accusations might sign her own death warrant. Mr. Henderson pulled up to her small apartment building. Sarah reached for the door handle, desperate to escape. "Same time next Friday?" Mrs. Henderson asked from the front seat, turning to look back at Sarah with that dead-eyed smile. Sarah's blood turned to ice. They wanted her to come back. Why? The other girls had disappeared after single nights of babysitting. What made Sarah different? Unless they knew she'd found something. Unless this was a test. Unless they wanted to see what she'd do with the information. Sarah's voice cracked. "I might be busy next Friday. My mother—" "Oh, I insist," Mrs. Henderson said, and there was steel beneath the sweetness now. We've grown so fond of you, the children adore you, and I know how much you need the money. Your mother's hospice care is so expensive, isn't it? It would be such a shame if you couldn't afford it anymore." The threat was crystal clear. Sarah felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Next Friday," she whispered. "Wonderful." Mrs. Henderson's smile widened. 7 o'clock sharp. Don't be late." Sarah practically ran to her apartment, not stopping until she was inside with the door locked and the chain fastened. Only then did she let herself collapse against the wall, her whole body shaking with terror and rage and helplessness. She pulled out her phone with trembling hands and searched for the names from the photographs. Every single girl was still less. "Ted is missing." No bodies had been found. No leads had panned out. 7 girls had vanished without a trace. And Sarah was supposed to be the 8th. But why? What did the Hendersons want? What was in that locked room? And who was the woman who had warned her? Sarah spent the night researching, driven by fear and determination. She learned that the Henderson house had been in the family for generations, that there had been rumors, over the years, of strange occurrences, that several people who'd worked there in various capacities had quit abruptly, though none had gone missing. Only the babysitters, always young, always female, always in desperate financial straits, disappeared. As dawn broke, Sarah made a decision. She wasn't going to be the 8th missing girl, but she also couldn't abandon Emma and Mason to whatever horror their parents represented. And she couldn't let those 7 other girls be forgotten. She thought about the voice in the locked room, the woman who'd known her name, who'd tried to warn her. "I tried to warn the others," she'd said. "I tried to make them leave." What if the woman in that room was one of the missing girls? What if she was alive, imprisoned, used somehow by the Hendersons? What if Sarah was the first babysitter brave or foolish enough to actually listen? Sarah pulled up the last photograph she'd seen. Rachel T., February 2024. Rachel Thompson, 19 years old. Disappeared exactly 11 months ago after telling her roommate she was babysitting for a wealthy family. The news articles said she'd been saving money for her father's kidney transplant, just like Sarah was trying to save money for her mother's care. The Hendersons had a type. Girls who were desperate. Girls who wouldn't ask too many questions because they couldn't afford to. Girls who wouldn't be believed even if they tried to report something suspicious. Because who would take the word of a poor teenager over a wealthy, respected family? Sarah looked at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. Her eyes were red-rimmed from lack of sleep, her face pale with exhaustion and fear. But beneath the terror, she found something else. Determination. Her mother had raised her to stand up for what was right, even when it was terrifying, especially when it was terrifying. She had 6 days until Friday, 6 days to figure out what was really happening in that house, 6 days to find evidence that the police would actually believe, 6 days to save herself, and possibly Rachel Thompson, and whoever else might still be alive in that locked room. But first, she needed to understand the history of that house. Sarah opened her laptop and began to dig deeper, searching for old records, historical archives, anything that might explain what the Hendersons were hiding. What she found made her blood run cold, but it also gave her hope, because understanding the enemy was the first step to defeating them. The house on Willowbrook Lane had been built in 1887 by a man named Marcus Henderson, ancestor to the current owners, but it had been built on the site of something older, a private asylum that had burned down under mysterious circumstances in 1885. Records from that era were sparse, but Sarah found mention of a scandal involving the asylum's doctor and accusations of illegal experiments. The dark wooden door, the one that didn't match the rest of the house, had survived the fire. According to one historical account, it had been the door to the asylum's isolation ward, where the most difficult patients were kept. Sarah sat back, her mind reeling. The Henderson family had built their fortune on this land, had constructed their legacy literally on top of suffering and death, and now they were continuing some twisted tradition, though Sarah didn't yet understand why. But she would. She had to. Because Friday was coming, and when she walked into that house again, Sarah Morrison wasn't going to be a victim. She was going to be a witness, a detective, a fighter. She thought of her mother, weak but fierce even in the face of death. She thought of Emma's sweet smile and Mason's trusting eyes. She thought of 7 missing girls whose families still waited for them to come home. Sarah picked up her phone and made a call she'd been avoiding. Her best friend Zoe answered on the 3rd ring. "Sarah, it's 6 in the morning. Are you okay?" "No," Sarah said honestly, "but I will be. Listen, I need you to do something for me. If anything happens to me, if I go missing or if I don't check in with you by midnight next Friday, I need you to go to the police with information I'm going to send you." "You're scaring me. What's going on?" Sarah took a deep breath. "I'm going to send you everything I've found. Photos, research, the address of the house where I babysit. Keep it safe. If I'm fine, we'll laugh about this later. But if I'm not—" Her voice broke slightly. "If I'm not, please make sure someone knows the truth. Please make sure those girls aren't forgotten." "Sarah, promise me, Zoe. I promise. But please, whatever you're planning, be careful." Sarah ended the call and spent the next hour composing an email to Zoe with all the evidence she'd gathered. Then she created a second email, scheduled to send automatically to the police if she didn't cancel it by midnight Friday. It wasn't much, but it was insurance. As the sun rose higher, Sarah allowed herself a few hours of fitful sleep. When she woke, she felt different, still afraid, but no longer paralyzed by fear. She had a plan. It was risky and possibly foolish, but it was something. The next 6 days passed in a blur of research and preparation. Sarah visited the library to dig through old newspaper archives. She drove past the Henderson house during the day, noting entry points and the locations of security cameras. She bought a small recording device and practiced hiding it in her clothing. She memorized the layout of the house, planned escape routes, thought through every possible scenario. And every night, she visited her mother in hospice, holding her frail hand and drawing strength from the woman who had taught her that some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed impossible. "You look troubled, sweetheart," her mother said on Thursday night, her voice weak but her eyes still sharp. "I'm okay, Mom, just tired." Her mother squeezed her hand with surprising strength. "You're lying. You've always been a terrible liar, Sarah Morrison. Whatever you're facing, remember this. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right even when you're terrified. You're braver than you know." Sarah felt tears slip down her cheeks. "I love you, Mom. I love you too, baby. More than you'll ever understand until you have children of your own someday." She paused, her breathing labored. "Promise me something. Promise me you'll fight for the life you deserve. Don't let anyone make you small. Don't let anyone silence you." "I promise," Sarah whispered, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. Friday arrived too quickly. Sarah dressed carefully in clothes with hidden pockets for her recording device. She left a note for Zoe just in case. She said a prayer to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. And then she drove to the Henderson house for what she knew might be the last time. Mrs. Henderson greeted her at the door with that same cold smile. "Right on time. You're such a responsible girl, Sarah. The children are already in their pajamas. This should be an easy night." "Where will you be?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "In case I need to reach you?" "Oh, we're not going anywhere tonight," Mrs. Henderson said, and Sarah's blood turned to ice. "We've decided to stay home. You don't mind, do you? We'll just be in the study downstairs. You won't even know we're here." Every alarm bell in Sarah's mind was ringing. They'd never been home while she babysat before. This was different. This was the trap closing. But Emma and Mason came running to greet her, and their genuine joy at seeing her strengthened Sarah's resolve. Whatever happened tonight, she would protect these children. Even if their parents were monsters, Emma and Mason deserved safety and innocence for as long as possible. The evening proceeded normally at first. Sarah played with the children, helped them brush their teeth, read them bedtime stories. But all the while, she was aware of two. Hendersons downstairs, aware of the locked room waiting at the end of the hall, aware of the recording device hidden in her pocket. At 10:30, both children were asleep. Sarah stood in the upstairs hallway, her heart pounding, and made a decision that would change everything. She walked slowly, deliberately, to the locked door at the end of the hall. She raised her hand and knocked, 3 soft taps. For a moment, nothing. "Then, Sarah? You came back." It was Rachel's voice. Sarah was sure of it now. "I'm going to get you out," Sarah whispered. "I know what they are. I know what they've done. But I need you to tell me everything. I need evidence they can't deny. The key, Rachel said urgently. It's in Mrs. Henderson's jewelry box. In their bedroom. But Sarah, you have to understand, it's not just about me. It's about all of us. We're all still here, all 7 of us. Sarah's knees nearly buckled. You're all alive. Not alive, Rachel said, and her voice broke. Not exactly. She keeps us. She feeds on us. On our fear, our despair, our youth. The house, it's not just a house, Sarah. It's hungry. And she's its caretaker. She's been its caretaker for generations. Before Sarah could respond, she heard footsteps on the stairs. Mrs. Henderson's voice called out, "Sarah? Is everything all right up there?" Sarah's mind raced. "Just checking the hall window," she called back, her voice somehow steady. "I thought I heard something outside." "How diligent of you." Mrs. Henderson appeared at the top of the stairs, and in the dim hallway light, Sarah saw her clearly for the first time. Really saw her. The skin was too smooth, too perfect, the eyes too bright, too knowing. He looked 30, but she'd been alive much, much longer. "Why don't you come downstairs, dear? I think we need to have a conversation." Sarah's hand slipped into her pocket, activating the recording device. "Of course, Mrs. Henderson." They descended the stairs together, and Sarah knew that whatever happened in the next hour would determine not just her fate, but the fate of 7 imprisoned girls and 2 innocent children sleeping upstairs. In the study, Mr. Henderson waited, his expression finally showing emotion, anticipation. "Sit down, Sarah," Mrs. Henderson said, gesturing to a chair. "You've been such a clever girl, finding the photographs, doing your research, asking all the right questions. I must admit I'm impressed. Most of the others were too frightened to think straight." Sarah sat, keeping her hands relaxed even though every muscle in her body was tense and ready to fight or flee. "What do you want from me?" "The same thing we've wanted from all the girls like you," Mrs. Henderson said, settling into a chair across from her. "Your fear, your desperation, your life force. You see, this house has been in my family for 5 generations, and for 5 generations we've fed it what it needs to keep us young, wealthy, healthy. The house gives us everything we desire, and in return, we give it what it hungers for." "Souls," Sarah whispered. "Energy," Mrs. Henderson corrected. "We're not monsters, Sarah. We don't kill. We simply borrow. The girls in that room, they're not dead. They're preserved, suspended between life and death, providing an endless source of sustenance for the house and, by extension, for us." "And the children?" Sarah demanded. "Emma and Mason, do they know what you are?" For the first time, genuine emotion crossed Mrs. Henderson's face. Something that might have been sadness. They're innocent, for now. When Emma turns 13, she'll inherit her role as keeper of the house. Mason will likely be sent away. Men don't have the same connection. It's a mother's burden passed from generation to generation. You're going to turn Emma into a monster like you. Mrs. Henderson's expression hardened. I'm going to give her power, immortality, everything a woman could want in a world that treats us as disposable. By making her complicit in torturing other women? Sarah stood, no longer able to contain her rage. You're not empowering her. You're cursing her. Sit down, Sarah. No. Sarah's voice was strong now, clear. I'm not going to be your 8th prisoner. And I'm not going to let you continue this. Those girls deserve to be free. Emma deserves a chance at a normal life. And every other desperate teenager out there deserves to not be preyed upon by people like you. Mrs. Henderson stood too, and when she spoke, her voice was no longer human. It was layered with something ancient and hungry. You don't have a choice, dear child. The house has already chosen you. From the moment you walked through that door, you were marked. The lights in the study began to flicker. The temperature dropped so quickly that Sarah could see her breath. And from everywhere and nowhere, Sarah heard voices, crying, pleading, the voices of 7 girls trapped between worlds. But Sarah had prepared for this. She pulled out her phone and hit dial on the number she'd already queued up. The police. This is Sarah Morisseau. I'm at 447 Willowbrook Lane, and I've just witnessed a confession to multiple kidnappings. I'm recording everything. Send help immediately. Mrs. Henderson laughed, and it was the sound of breaking glass. They'll never get here in time. And even if they do, what will they find? A hysterical teenager making wild accusations against a respected family? We've been doing this for over a century, Sarah. We know how to cover our tracks." "Maybe," Sarah said, backing toward the door. "But I'm not alone. Everything I've found, every piece of evidence, every research note, it's all been sent to multiple people. If I disappear, the truth goes public. And even if you can explain away one missing babysitter, you can't explain away 8. Eventually someone will look deeper. Eventually your house of horrors will fall." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Mrs. Henderson's face. That's when Sarah ran. She flew up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. Behind her, she heard Mrs. Henderson screaming, heard Mr. Henderson's heavy footsteps giving chase. But Sarah had youth and desperation on her side. She reached the 2nd floor and sprinted to the Hendersons' bedroom. The jewelry box was on the dresser, ornate and locked. Sarah grabbed it and smashed it against the floor. Among the scattered pearls and diamonds, a single iron key glinted in the moonlight. Sarah snatched it up and ran to the locked door, her hands shaking so badly she could barely get the key in the lock. Behind her, footsteps thundered up the stairs. She turned the key, felt the ancient lock give way, and threw open the door. What she saw inside would haunt her forever. The room was massive, far larger than should have been possible given the dimensions of the house. And suspended in the air, held by invisible forces, were 7 young women. They hung like paintings, their eyes open but unseeing, their mouths frozen in silent screams. They weren't quite alive and weren't quite dead. They were trapped in an eternal moment of terror. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry." "Don't be sorry," Rachel's voice said, and Sarah realized it was coming from one of the suspended forms. "Finish it. The house's power is in the door. Destroy the door and we go free." Sarah looked at the dark wooden door, at its intricate carvings, at the wrongness of it. Without hesitating, she ran back into the hallway, grabbed the fire extinguisher from the wall, and began smashing the door with all her strength. The house screamed. It was the only way to describe the sound, a wail of rage and hunger that shook the very foundations. The walls began to crack, the floor buckled, and Mrs. Henderson appeared in the hallway, no longer even pretending to be human. Her form flickered between solid and shadow, beautiful and monstrous. "You're destroying everything," she shrieked. "Generations of power, you stupid girl." But Sarah didn't stop. She swung the fire extinguisher again and again until the ancient wood splintered, until the carvings fractured, until the door that had stood for nearly 140 years finally shattered. The moment it broke, light exploded from the room behind it. Not normal light. This was blinding, cleansing, pure. The 7 suspended girls began to descend, their forms solidifying, becoming real again. They drew shuddering breaths, their first true breaths in months or years. Mrs. Henderson let out one final scream before she began to age rapidly. 30 years, 50, 70, 100. Within seconds, she was nothing but dust on the carpet. Downstairs, Sarah heard Mr. Henderson collapse, suffering the same fate. The house began to shake itself apart, but Sarah was already moving. She ran to Emma's room and scooped up the sleeping child, then grabbed Mason from the next room. The 7 freed girls, weak but alive, were stumbling out of the room. "Everyone out!" Sarah shouted. "Now!" They fled down the stairs as the house collapsed around them. The walls crumbled, the floors gave way, the very structure seemed to be eating itself. Sarah led them all out into the front yard, the children clutched in her arms, the 7 rescued girls stumbling behind her. They'd barely made it to the street when the entire house imploded with a sound like thunder. Where the Henderson mansion had stood moments before, there was now nothing but rubble and dust, and the echo of a century's worth of screams finally silenced. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Sarah sank to her knees in the grass, Emma and Mason waking up confused in her arms. The 7 girls gathered around her, Rachel placing a shaking hand on Sarah's shoulder. "You saved us," Rachel whispered. "You actually saved us." Sarah looked at the faces around her. Young women who'd been given a second chance, children who were free from their parents' dark legacy, and herself, alive and whole despite everything. "We saved each other," Sarah said softly. The police arrived minutes later, then ambulances, then reporters. The story that M. urged over the following weeks was sensational even by modern standards. 7 missing girls found alive, a wealthy family's dark secret exposed. evidence of supernatural occurrences that scientists couldn't fully explain. But the truth was simpler than any headline could capture. A teenage girl, desperate and afraid, had chosen courage over compliance. She'd chosen to believe a voice in the darkness. She'd chosen to fight rather than flee. Sarah's mother lived to see her daughter hailed as a hero. She passed away 2 months later, peacefully, knowing her daughter was safe and that the medical bills would be covered by the reward money from 7 grateful families. Emma and Mason were placed with distant relatives, far from the cursed legacy of their family name. Sarah visited them often, and they remembered her not as the babysitter who destroyed their home, but as the hero who freed them from a fate they'd been too young to understand. The 7 rescued girls became Sarah's lifelong friends. They'd shared something no one else could understand: the terror of being trapped, the miracle of being freed, the strength it took to rebuild their lives after horror. And Sarah, who'd started that Friday night as a desperate teenager who needed money to save her dying mother, ended it as something else entirely: a young woman who understood that the greatest power any of us has is the choice to do what's right, even when we're terrified. Especially when we're terrified. Years later, when Sarah told this story to her own children, she always ended it the same way. When you hear crying in the darkness, when you see something wrong that everyone else is ignoring, when you're afraid, but someone needs help, that's when you find out who you really are. Courage isn't fearlessness. Courage is being terrified and doing the right thing anyway. Always remember that. The house on Willowbrook Lane was never rebuilt. The land was eventually turned into a park with 7 trees planted in a circle, 1 for each girl who was rescued. In the center, a plaque reads, "In memory of all those trapped in darkness, and in honor of those brave enough to break down the door." Sarah visited that park sometimes, especially on difficult days. She'd sit beneath the trees and remember the night she learned that one person, even one frightened teenager, could change everything. That desperate circumstances don't have to make us victims. That the scariest monsters often wear human faces. And that listening to the voice that tells you something is wrong, even when everyone else says to ignore it, might be the most important thing you ever do. The babysitter heard footsteps upstairs. The kids were asleep, and instead of running away from what scared her, Sarah Morrison ran toward it. In doing so, she saved 7 lives, freed 2 children from a cursed legacy, and proved that sometimes the youngest, most powerless-seeming person in the room is actually the strongest one there. That's a story worth remembering. That's a story worth telling. And that's a message the world will always need to hear. The end.